What's good YouTube, welcome back to the channel. This week another exciting deck profile for Shadowverse. I'm covering my top 4 deck for BSF friends as I've been playing Forestcraft. So if anybody's seen my last video, I was playing Dragoncraft, and at the time that was the only craft I was actually playing. But recently I bought a Forest collection and I ended up actually really liking the craft and being so convinced that I wanted to take it to BSF. I played together with my friends Deli and Azure as we made it to top 4, but sadly did not manage to get any medal because we ended in 4th place. But this deck actually went 3-2, I want to say, because we had 4 rounds of Swiss. We had a bye, and then I won 1 round of the quarterfinals, to say so. So honestly, it had a pretty good track record. And because you've seen the title of the video, the deck I played was Beauty and the Beast, the Fable deck for Forest, which is honestly kind of funny because that meant that we had 2 Fable decks on our team. And we could have had 3 if I'm thinking about it, so that's really cool. But so I went specifically with this deck because I felt like I had the most control over my games while playing this, because this deck reverse stacks your deck, which means you always know when you'll find your win condition in the very late game, which is something that was really good during set 5, but now with set 6 coming out, there is a chance that we may not be able to actually pull the same things off with this deck as we have in the previous format. So I still want to cover this deck, want to show you what I played in this specific list and talk about my games for the tournament, but maybe this is not a deck you can take to a set 6 format, but we'll have to see. So for my rounds, in the first round I faced off against the Galmio deck, which is the dragon deck. That's the most popular, I'd say, and actually the deck I was originally planning on taking to the tournament. Funnily enough, I did not feel confident enough when playing the deck, where I felt like if I made small mistakes, I would get punished really hard for them. And if I didn't draw the right pieces or not enough of my good pieces, I wouldn't win games as easily as some other decks could. So I felt like just playing the deck itself felt like a bit of a challenge that would hinder me in maximizing my potential. If that's a weird way to say it is because I don't really know it myself, but it was more of a gut feeling, I guess, at the end of the day, where I just did not feel confident enough in the deck, even though the deck itself, when I see other people play it, is super strong. And so during that game, I made the most fatal mistake you can ever make against a dragon deck, and that's forget that Forte exists. So to give the entire situation a bit of background, I believe my opponent was on low health, and so I realized I could win on 2 turns. My idea was to promote this guy, swing with him into face because he has Storm when he comes from the X area, and then bank on the fact that he would survive and I would just finish the game next turn. I had 12 health at the time, and my opponent played, I forgot the name of the dragon card, but there's this 5-cost dragon card that draws 2, discards 1, and then on Evo heals for 5. So my opponent played this the turn prior, and so he had this 5/5 with ward on his field that he did not ward. And my idea was like, if they play Galmio next turn, I believe they were going to 7 play points, they wouldn't have had enough play points to actually win the game right there. So instead, I was like, yeah, there's really no way they can finish me off, so I can go for this aggressive play and threaten lethal, so they have to deal with my card, and I believe I had an elephant in my hand, which is a card will go over later. And then they drop the Forte, and I'm like counting. Okay, so the dragon has 5 attack, Forte has 7 attack, wait, I'm dead. And so I lost that first game, and it felt terrible, but it was fully my own mistake. There were different plays I could have done that would have saved me, and yeah, I just did not realize Forte was a thing, even though I played Dragon myself. So it's a sad way to lose, but it's obviously not the most terrible thing, because we got a bye the round after. So we got like 30 minutes to rest up, which was probably the thing we needed to get ourselves out of the losing mindset and go into round 3 with renewed energy. In round 3, we faced off against the same opponents we played in our final round for the bronze medal, and I played against Steve Sword. And while during the game I felt very confident on my plays and was like, yes, I'm in control, I'm going to win this, after the game, my opponent showed me that he still had on Storm Piece in hand, which would deal, I believe, 4 damage. And if they drew a second copy of that card, they would have committed and won the game. So it was honestly a pretty close game, but I managed to close it out by somewhat reverse decking my deck and guaranteeing a Beauty and the Beast. So the entire thing I like about this deck came up and I managed to push them for game. And then during the final round of Swiss, I played against the Dragon deck, and this time I managed to beat them out a lot faster. Those were about my rounds for the Swiss format. Then in Top Cut, my first round was against a Leshena player, which was one of the decks I totally did not expect to see at the tournament, because I love Leshena as a deck, but I totally believe it's a bit of a weak deck because it has a lot of bad matchups. And when they have a bad matchup, they can get Leshena down, they can get their win con off, and it's just really hard for them to win the game. But this guy played 3 copies of Earth, managed to bind 2 of my Beauty and the Beast in the EX area. I again reverse stacked my deck and managed to get my copy of him in the EX area, then promoted on the field. And once it was on the field, because it has aura, they did not have a good way to out it, and thus it gave me the game. But that game was super long, and it was probably one of the cooler games I've played the entire day, because it's Rune, and they were doing so much, and I loved it. But yeah, Beauty and the Beast, best counter to Rune, because it has aura. And I think the maximum damage they could do with like a spell was 4, I think. They had a board wipe that dealt 4 damage to everything. And since this was 7, and I believe I even buffed it, so it went up to 11, they could not out it. It was too strong. So yeah, really cool card, and a bit of a counter to Rune. And I knew I had to win on this card, so them banishing 2 of them from my EX area really sucked. But the fact that I could reverse deck, I believe it was like the 22... I believe I put 22 cards on the bottom of my deck, and then I knew that the next time I would resolve the spell, which the amulet, which we'll go over later, I would find this card. So yeah, super cool. And then for the final rounds, we played against the team we played in our third round, which was against Thief Swords. But now the roles were reversed. My opponent went first and I went second, which is something interesting I found out about this deck, where if I go first, I have a really high win rate. If I go second, I don't really get the same chances to do my setup, which makes me lose a lot of tempo and actually ends up losing me most of my games. And so this happened. My opponent goes first. He's playing Thief Sword, and he has the most perfect 2 first turns. Like, when I saw those plays, I was kind of jealous. I wanted to be the one playing Thief Sword. But what they did was they played this card that says mill the top card of your opponent's deck and gain attack every time your card mills. And then on their second turn, they played the spell that gave it aura and I believe +1 attack, +2 defense, making it immediately like this 3/4 with aura. And I really don't have good ways to deal with those things because I need to evolve to deal with it, but we're at 2 play points and I don't really have an evo for 2 play points. So I was at least guaranteed to take 4 or 5 damage there. And that really set me back. I did manage to get some setups ready in my EX area, but nothing really to push the game back to where I could win. And I believe they even Leonidas me at some point where they got the banner up and then they did like 8 damage with the usurp card that says mill 1, get +1 attack if your opponent has X amount of cards and drop. And so yeah, they just had a lot of pressure going into turn 7, and that just meant that I could not keep up with that. So they played really well. I really can't say anything bad about it. And it's really cool to see how different going first and going second against such a deck is for me. So yeah, those were my games for the day. I'm honestly pretty proud of the record of getting top cut, but I feel like I could do better if I worked out this list even further. But the one thing about this is though, Fable is really hard to build, and I have changed this list several times during testing, and each time I made the change, I had to revert it back to the original list because I felt like changes kind of ruined the consistency. Let's go over what's in this deck to know why we need consistency. So first of all, I'm playing triple copies of a Bellringer Angel. The reason this card is currently so good is because its Evo deals 2 damage to something, so it's one of my few ways to actually deal with early aggro. I do have to say I did not see this card all that often. I think maybe during testing I did actually do some really cool things with this, but during the tournament maybe I've played one of them and I don't think I've ever evolved it. So yeah, triple Bellringer, mainly for the control, but it's also just one of the most valuable early game plays, I guess, because it gets you a card, and so extra cards or replacing cards is always good in this deck because we need hand size. We then have 2 copies of Actress Feria, and Feria is one of the Fable cards, so she's searchable with R. Alice, which we'll go over later, and one of the amulets we play. So she's just a target. I don't really care for her as an early aggro piece. I suppose it could be good, but generally I try to keep her in the back just for that big turn when I want to buff my Beauty and the Beast, because she's a counter that I get to put on him, and so he becomes a lot bigger. And then depending on how much play points you have, it's kind of as if she has pseudo storm, because instead of dealing 2 she deals 1, but being able to put a lot of counters on him makes him bigger, and so easier to finish out games and harder for him to be removed. So yeah, she's a 2 because I don't really care for her all that much, but she's a searchable target, so adds consistency. We then have triple copies of Harvest Festival. And Harvest Festival is probably one of the most well-known forest cards at this point. It's the amulet you bounce because it gives you a draw, and you can also just sack it with its own effect to heal 1, which honestly the heal 1 is really relevant, because if you know your opponent has a lethal line for a certain amount of damage, just being able to heal a single point often can get you just out of that spot. So I really like this card, and it's just 2 play points for a draw in a deck that does not play anything above 6 play points anyway. So it allows me to get into my pieces in the late game as well. So it never feels like a dead card, at least to me. We then have, I messed up, 2 copies of Nature's Guidance, our main bounce spell, and this one is mainly used to bounce our amulets, but can also be used to bounce one of our other cards if we want to save it, like saving an elephant in the late game just to do 2 storm turns back to back is really scary. So this thing could actually be used in many ways, but generally if you see it in the early game, it's just to bounce your amulet. And then the final amulet, and probably the most important amulet of the deck, we have the Woodland Band. And I think this is a card I do need to explain because some people will not have seen it before. So Woodland Band says you check the top 4 cards of your deck, you then put a Fable follower from your deck into the X area from those 4 cards, and then the rest go to the bottom of your deck in any order. And this specific line where you put the cards on the bottom of your deck in any order means that you get to reverse stack your deck. Because you want to resolve this thing as much as possible, because obviously it's just a +1, and if you bounce it to your hand you can play it again, get another search off. This fills up your EX area, so you counter silence decks that discard your hand, or decks that get bonuses from you having a low hand size, because if your EX area is filled with good cards, you don't really have to waste hand size to get plays off. And then for its final ability, you can put this in your cemetery and rest it to choose a Fable follower on your field and give it a Fable counter. So this kind of works like Feria, but it removes itself from the field and buffs our Beauty and the Beast. So this is probably the most important bounce target, but if we see the Harvest Festival, honestly both are really fine. This gets us cards in hand and this gets us cards in the X area, so both really have their way of plussing, and they kind of do the same, but this specifically finds those Fable followers, and if we can find Beauty and the Beast, it kind of sets us up for that win con on turn 6, potentially turn 7. So yeah, that's it for our amulets and our 1 costs. So we run quite a lot of 1 costs in that because we are combo deck, but let's go into the 2 costs. One of my favorite cards in the entire deck is Marvelous Sunday, and she's an Uma card that says Fanfare, choose another card on your field, return it to your hand, and give your leader +2 health. And so what happens often is that my opponent aggroes me early, drops one of those 2/2 followers, and just starts swinging face, and I can't really stop that. I don't really have a good way to stop it unless I open the Bell Ringer, which can then deal with it, but generally you don't have that, and you're like forced to play one of your amulets. You then play Sunday, bounce the amulet to your hand, heal up. Now you have a 2/3 your opponent kind of wants to deal with as well, because it has good defense and can probably swing into their stuff if they attack with it, survive, and you still have a body left. But you just bounced your plussing tool, so you're setting up your future plays while also getting value. So Sunday, really good. Her stat line is one of her best features, but also the fact that she heals your leader for 2, minimizing your opponent's early rush. We then also have Ancient Elf, which is probably the most well-known bouncer in the game. It's a legendary for a reason because it can become a 5/5, and it's a 2-cost 1/2 evolve. So while I said earlier that we don't have good 2-cost 1/2 evolves, this is the best 2-cost 1/2 evolve you can find. If you have a setup, this thing can become 5/5, but I've noticed that in most games where I have to be fast, this becomes a 3/3, and 3/3 is a bad stat. honestly. If you make it 4-4, it's still bad. You kind of want it to be a 5-5 to dodge the most removal they have. But yeah, I sometimes just aggressively do this, make it a 2-2, 3-3 by bouncing one of my amulets, and kind of hope they can't out it, so I have a 5-5 next turn to swing into phase and put a lot of early pressure on, while also just bouncing my cards and doing that setup. So this eats a lot of their spells, but that's also fine kind of, because then she did serve her purpose. But you kind of have to be smart about it as well, because she is so strong and she's also your best defensive tool, because we don't actually play other wards in this deck. This is the only ward we have, so we have to be sparingly with it as well, in the sense that it could be crucial protection for the turn you need protection. For our last 2-2, we're playing the Flower Princess, and I actually do have foil versions of this card, and I forgot to put them in the deck. So we managed to pull some from the prize packs we got, and then traded some of our cards away to get 3 copies of this card, because it's so good. It's amazing. And I think it might actually see play in the set 6 meta as well, since this card actually has a really cool effect. So when she's put on the field, she gets a fairy token in your EX area, which sets you up for the set 6 pixie combos. But also, it just makes it easier, I suppose, to get combos off anyway. It's not like we do run many combos in this deck, but we do have cards that benefit from EX area. So the fairies can actually come up as being useful. I don't play with them in mind, but they're an added piece that can be nice to have. And then also, if you are at combo 3, so if you've played 2 more cards before you played her, she gets a Fable counter. And then she can rest herself, remove a Fable counter, and deal 3 damage to something. So she's one of our best removal tools we have that's searchable. The only flaw is that she needs to be combo 3. And we can be aggressive and do something like the Woodland Band and rest it to put the Fable counter on here, but that feels really bad because we kind of want to abuse our Woodland Band, so it's one of those trade-offs. And if we did find the Feria, I suppose we can always rest the Feria to put a counter on here, but then we have 2 targets they can just swing into, so it sucks, but it's still one of our best removals, and it's searchable, and it's a good stat line, and it's a 2 cost, so there's a lot of good things about it, but the combo tree is the one flaw, I'd say. It's rough to get it, but if you do get it, it's really nice. Even getting 2 of these down and doing it on 2 things is also super strong, because then you can remove up to a 6 cost by just using 2 costs. So yeah, good cards, but combo 3 is not the easiest thing to achieve in a timely manner. We then go into our 3 costs, and for 3 costs, you probably know the most important one. It's your girl, Alison the Wonderland Explorer. And this card is so strong, I actually played 3 copies in main deck, 3 copies in the Evo deck. She just gets us her Fable counter, she sets up 2 cards in the X area, at least that's what she's supposed to do, and she's a 4-4, so she swings into most things to clear them. And that thing about setting 2 cards up, it actually only went off once, I think, during the entire tournament. I think most of the time I just found 1 card, and it kind of makes sense because my deck is as pure as it can be Fable, but the amount of Fable cards that we play is, I believe, 18, while the average egg deck plays like 23 Fable cards, so she has a lot less targets in this deck, and that might just mean she whiffs a little bit more, but we also care about her stacking cards, so she also just checks top 4, which means another 4 cards have been checked, and you just stack it up where you go. We checked 4 cards, 8 cards, 12 cards, and after a while you have a stack of like 12 cards at the bottom of your deck, and you're 25 cards deep, so you know, like, if I resolve 2 more of those, I will be pretty close to my stack. I'll probably draw into it in a certain amount of turns. So yeah, her effect is really strong. If you resolve multiple, you get pretty close to your stack anyway, so she's a really, really good card, and she synergizes well with what the deck wants to do. We then also have one of the most surprising Fable followers, Magical Fairy Lilac. So she's a 3 cost, 1-4, so a pretty abysmal stat line. But what she says is, for 1 cost you can remove a Fable counter from her and destroy anything on the field. And this thing, if your opponent disrespects this card and just leaves it on the field, it'll deal with so much. It's kind of crazy. So one of the things that I do happen to do, if I have this and a Beauty and the Beast in my EX area and I play my Alice, I tend to just put the Fable counter on my Lilac because Lilac is not once per turn. She's capable of getting her own counter by resting herself, but then her second skill says pay 1, remove a Fable counter and destroy something on the field. This can be done multiple times, and so for 5 play points you get to destroy the 2 biggest things on your field, which most decks in the current format will not have that many cards on their field. If they do have too many cards on the field, we have another counter for that, but she can be super impactful, and the 4 defense does help her a lot. So she's a bit situational, but since we do not have that great of low cost removal, having this higher cost removal, so to say, is actually really good for the deck. And it's searchable. For our final 3 costs, we do play 3 Rose Gardener, and Rose Gardener, she doesn't say that much on her card right now, but when she evos, she chooses another card on the field and bounces it to the hand. And this is not your own card, this is one of your opponent's cards. So this allows you to remove their wards and then go for your aggro plays or just punish them if they don't really get value out of their play with evo, because you just drop this down, you bounce their thing to the hand, and it's a 4/4 that's just sitting there while you still have your other stuff on the field. And you don't even have to swing with it because they still have to deal with it, so yeah. This card is really strong and it's going to see a lot more play in the future sets when we get a lot more Storm cards. So look out for this thing. Evo also has a combo 3 effect, but the combo 3 effect barely ever comes up. I think the only situations where you kind of get the payoff from it is if you played this earlier and you got the fairy, and then you play like something like Woodland Band and a fairy and then this. So you've spent like 5 play points and 1 Evo point. That's the specific situation in which I've triggered the draw, but like outside of that, generally you don't have play points to get the draw because you need at least 6 if you don't include the evo point. So yeah, 5 or 6. At that point, you probably want to be doing other things anyway. But really strong cards and gives you enough control to get somewhere in the late game. Alright, that's it for the 3 costs. We're now jumping all the way to 5 costs since there's no 4 costs in the deck, but obviously all those evos are pseudo 4 costs anyway. And we're playing CC, the Woodland Witch, or Cassiopeia, or however you pronounce it. Probably my favorite card in all of Forest. What it says is Fanfare, select any number of enemy followers on the field and deal X damage divided between them. X equals the number of cards in your hand and EX area. And as you've noticed, a lot of these cards put cards in your EX area, so she has hit for things like 10 damage, I believe. I had 7 damage, 9 damage. They're crazy. And we run 5, and I've had games where I bricked on them, where I had like multiple of them after each other and just did not have enough hand save or EX area left. But once you're high rolling, this thing kind of seals the game on its own sometimes. I've had also games where I dropped this, left it on the field, swung with it, the turn after, used Nature's Guidance, bounced it back to my hand, and then played it again to wipe the field if they did not put up a ward. So it's such an impactful card. It's kind of like Forest version of Themis' Decree, as long as you do the Forest things where you do set up the X area. And that's why I really love this card. I feel like it puts you in such a good position to win from. So amazing card. And the Code Geass alt arts are really pretty, but the base art is also really cool. So yeah, I kind of like this one more, but it's all up to you. Right, we go into our final cards. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. This is Forest current win con in set 5, and it fits in every single Forest deck because every single Forest deck wants to have a big hand size and just go aggro. And what happens a lot with this card, mainly during testing, I did not manage to pull it off, I think, during my games. I think one of my opponents had to assail into it to destroy it. And another one of the sword players, he used the 1 cost to engage it and then swing into it. But it's such a threatening card because you play it and it gets attack and defense equal to the number of cards in your hand. But before doing that, it gives you the option to bounce any amount of cards on your field to your hand. So generally this is a 6/6 or a 7/7. I believe you can even go 8/8. It gets really big. But instead of attacking with it immediately because it has Storm, you generally can just leave it there. And if your opponent doesn't deal with it or sets up a wall of wards, you just evolve it for 4. It gets that buff again. And so it becomes like a 12/12, a 14/14, something crazy, and swings for that amount of damage, which more often than not will just win you the game outright. So yeah, Elephant is crazy, but you kind of have to learn to work with it. I feel like I've I could have used him more aggressively in some games, and that might have actually won me the games faster because of how hard it is to deal for your opponent if they don't have something like an execute or a way to swing into him, since he just threatens so much damage and most of your stuff is gonna be setting up hand or EX area, so even the things you play from the EX area can then be bounced back to your hand, so you generally have enough on field or hand to accommodate him. So that's the elephant. And then for the final cards, the big star of the deck, Beauty and the Beast. We've talked about it way too much, but what does it actually do? It's a card with Rush, Aura, and Aura is really important because that means it doesn't die to the same weaknesses as the Elephant does, because Elephant they can execute while they cannot execute Beauty and the Beast. And so I like having both, because if I know my opponent plays a lot of those removal spells, I can just decide to focus more on the Aura plays than the Elephant plays. Anyway, so put a Fable counter on this card, and then if it was put anywhere other than from hand, give it Storm. So the idea is that you put this into the X area with both Woodland Band and Alice in Wonderland, and then when you play it from there, it has Storm. If you play it from hand, it has Rush still, so you can totally just swing it into something and hope to clear it. It has a lot of defense, so it generally even survives if you do that. And then it has an Act ability where you play 1 play point and remove any number of Fable counters from this card to give it +1/+1 for every counter removed. And I feel like 4 is the most average thing I've done with this. It becomes 9 attack, 11 defense, which makes it really, really strong and hard to remove. It has Aura, they kind of just are forced to Bane into it or something, which not all decks have access to. If I leave it standing the first turn, it's a 5/7, and then they also just really don't have good ways to deal with it, because most things with a sail are not really gonna clear this unless they're playing Abyss, at which point I feel like against Abyss I've got more tools to win the game anyway. So yeah, he is super strong and he's like an extra elephant type of card. They do very similar things and they achieve very similar win conditions, but there's small differences where this can become super massive and this becomes slightly massive, but as Aura, so it has protection against what your opponent would generally use against the elephant. So I love their synergy, and I love the fact that I have 6 targets I can reverse deck my deck for. So depending on what I see in the early game and have to mulligan back, or I see my first top check and I see there's an elephant in there, I'll start counting my deck backwards and I'll know when I'll draw into the elephant, because a turn 10 elephant is also super lethal, because then you can immediately evolve. So yeah, being able to reverse stack these is super cool. As for the Evo deck, I think that's one of the things we haven't talked about. I have 2 empty sleeves, and the reason I have 2 empty sleeves is because I do not actually own 3 Bellringers or 2 Bellringers Evos. I actually had to borrow these 2 from a friend, well, one is actually from Delhi and one is actually from Azure, so I'm borrowing from both of my teammates and I have not given them back, but I did give the 2 Evos back already at the event. So these would be 2 Evos, and I like 2 Evos because if you have 1 Evo, you'll use it in the early game, and that Evo will deal with something and you'll then just ward your Bellringer, have it die, and you get the draw. But in the late game, if you dead draw into the Bellringer, you would still able to evolve the Bellringer and then swing that Bellringer into your opponent's ward, and that way you get a draw. Obviously that costs you 3 play points, which is a lot, because it's 1 to play, 2 to evolve, but being able to draw into something that could give you game is obviously a lot more impactful. So yeah, that's why I still like having 2 Bellringer Evos. We then have 1 Elephant Evo, which is the one from the Showdown, and I really like how foily it is, because it's an SL like. But yeah, this thing is super crazy, but if you do it, you kind of want to finish on this guy anyway, so you only need 1, you'll never use more. We then have Rose Gardener, which I run at 2, so that's the girl that bounces something, and then if you're combo 3, you draw a card. So the extra draw can come up, but it's really hard to get. It's mainly just to bounce something, and if you have 2 cards on the field, you can just 4/4 into the other card. This comes up even in set 6 meta, so you'll see a lot more of this card. We then have, they're not entirely in order. We have 2 copies of the Ancient Elf Evo, because Ancient Elf is our only ward in the deck and becomes a 5/5, and for that reason can deal with some things that are harder to remove, because 5 attack is a lot. I really like playing her at 2. And then we run 3 copies of our Alice. And the reason I run 3 copies of Alice is because I value the reverse deck so much that I just need, I guess I don't need to see triple Alice, but if Alice finds Alice, I'm super happy, because I know I'll go really deep in my deck and are most likely hitting my stack by turn 8 or something. And so yeah, that guarantees me the fact that I can find an elephant or a Beauty and the Beast at my most likely finishing turn. Right. And that's it for the entire deck. The deck is pretty standard, I'd say, but it's really what brought me a lot of joy at the tournament. I feel like you get a lot of control over the entire matchup because you're searching out your cards and you have a lot of ways to bounce your cards so you can preserve your aggression. We have ways to play around aura and also plays that do not play around aura, so we can punish decks that don't have good removal. And we then also just have healing with our Marvelous Sunday and our Harvest Festival, which allows us to play really smart when our opponent has a certain amount of damage available and we can counter it. And then against the aggressive matchups like Sword, CC is our best friend because we set up the EX area and we just blow up their entire field multiple times. Because I believe this was the thing that also just won me that first game in Swiss against Sword. And I don't believe I saw her in my final game, which might have made a difference if I could interrupt this field by turn 5. But I believe I was too far behind anyway to get enough value out of that anyway. So yeah, this is it for the deck. If you have any more questions, you can totally drop them down below. I would love to talk more Shadowverse because Shadowverse is such a cool game. And yeah, if you have any cool ideas for us that you want us to cover, cool decks you want to see from set 6, totally just drop them down below and we'll talk about them later. See you in the next one. Bye.